I'm Professor Pamela Nadell. I hold American University's Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History, and I am also Director of the Jewish Studies Program. And it is my extraordinary privilege and honor to welcome you to our university this evening, and especially to welcome Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. This evening's event is co-sponsored with the School of International Service, and I bring greetings from its dean, Jim Goldgeier, to this audience and to our distinguished guest as well. What I'd like to do is introduce our speakers, and then we will commence. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks is a global religious leader and respected public intellectual, and the award-winning author of more than 25 books. You will be able to buy his most recent book on your way out this evening. A frequent contributor to radio, television, and the press around the world, Rabbi Sacks currently holds professorships at New York University and Yeshiva University and King's College London, and has been awarded 16 honorary degrees and numerous prizes in recognition of his work. Described by His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, as a light unto the nation, Rabbi Sacks was Chief Rabbi of the UK and the Commonwealth from 1991 to 2013. His latest book is titled Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence. It was a national bestseller in the UK and has just been published here in the United States. Joining him in conversation about confronting religious violence are two of my American University colleagues. Professor and Ambassador Akbar Ahmed is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies here at American University, and the former Pakistani High Commissioner to the UK and Ireland. Professor Ahmed has been called the world's leading authority on contemporary Islam by the BBC. He has served as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and was the first distinguished chair of Middle East and Islamic Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy. Previously, Professor Ahmed was the Iqbal Fellow, that's a chair of Pakistani Studies, and a fellow of Selwyn College at the University of Cambridge. He has also taught at Harvard and Princeton. He is the author of over a dozen award-winning books, including a quartet of studies published by the Brookings Press, examining relations between the West and the world of Islam after 9/11. He has just completed a new documentary, Journey into Europe, and it's a companion book will appear in 2016. My colleague in Jewish Studies and in the History Department is Professor Michael Renner. He is Professor of Jewish History and Culture at the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich, and also holds American University's Seymour and Lillian Abinson Chair in Israel Studies, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Lillian Abinson among us this evening. And he is also the director of AU Center for Israel Studies. He has taught at Indiana and Brandeis universities and held visiting appointments at the universities of Haifa, Paris, and Budapest, and at Stanford, Berkeley, and Johns Hopkins. He is international president of the Leo Baeck Institute, a member of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences. He has served on many academic boards, including the Association for Israel Studies, the Israel Institute, the DAAD Center of the University of Haifa, and he is the board chair of the Franz Rosenzweig Research Center of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His books have been translated into 10 languages. They include A Short History of the Jews, Prophets of the Past, Interpreters of Jewish History, and I could go on. He has also edited, at last count, at least 17 books. And his new book, which will be published in German in the coming year and then to be followed by an English translation, is titled Israel, a Jewish State Between Dream and Reality. Please join me in welcoming this evening's distinguished guests.
Thank you very much, Professor Nadell, for this wonderful warm words of welcome. Can you all hear me well? I'll try my best, but I think the mic is on. It is a true honor and pleasure to welcome our common guest here, Lord Sachs, and my colleague, Professor Akbar Ahmed, two of the leading scholars of religion or religions, two, I think, of the most exciting thinkers of our days, and also two amazing spiritual leaders. And I should add, it is unfortunately cannot be taken for granted that we have a leading Jewish and a leading Muslim thinker sitting here in what hopefully will be constructive, peaceful dialogue, unfortunately not taken for granted in our days. Let me say a word about the structure of tonight. We will have a discussion between Lord Sachs and Ambassador Ahmed for about 45 minutes, followed by a short intervention by Reverend Eldridge, a prominent, not only prominent professor here at AU, but also force for human rights. And we will also have a Q&A session for about half an hour, concluded by a short statement of Rabbi Lustig, Senior Rabbi of Washington Hebrew Congregation, who's co-sponsoring this event. Rabbi Sachs, in the center of our discussion tonight is your recent book, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence, a wonderful book on so many accounts. We'll get, I think, a small sense of it, and then you'll all read it and know much more about it. You make a point in your book that there is a connection between religion and violence. And one of the chapters actually opens with a well-known and rather depressing quote by Jonathan Swift, who once said, "We have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another." So I would like to start by asking you, you coined a term in this book which I found fascinating, altruistic evil. You talk about evil for a sacred cause. And I would just like you to elaborate a little bit on that notion. And then maybe, Ambassador Ahmed, please jump in and feel free in commenting on this notion.
Professor Brenner, Professor Ahmed, Ambassador Ahmed, can I just begin by adding my own thanks to the people who helped make this possible, to the American University School of International Service, to Professor Pamela Nadell and the Jewish Studies Programmer, and Rabbi Bruce Lustig and the Washington Hebrew Congregation. I want a special thanks to Bob Kogod, who's contributed so much to this university and the intellectual life of this nation and beyond. But above all, last but absolutely most important, my beloved friend now of many years, Professor Ahmed. I cannot begin to tell you what a benign influence he was. When I first came to know you, you were Pakistani High Commissioner in Britain. And perhaps it would be enlightening to know the context in which we first came together. There was a journalist from the Wall Street Journal, Daniel Pearl, who was tragically murdered in Karachi in 2002. This was a terrible moment, a blow in every level, human, religious, political. And I discovered that Professor Ahmed actually knew and had formed a friendship with Daniel's father, Judea Pearl. And this intrigued me. And in those days, I used to do a television program each year for the BBC, and I thought it would be fascinating for the British public just to be able to eavesdrop on a conversation between Judea Pearl and Akbar Ahmed. And I filmed them in conversation in our then home, well, the official residence. Couldn't afford it these days. And then I took you both, if you remember, into a Muslim school in London and a Jewish school in London, and we saw the impact of this extraordinary and very counterintuitive friendship. And it was at that moment that I realized Professor Ahmed has what we so need now. Somebody who has enough religion to make us love one another, not just hate one another. And one sentence that Judea said to you and to me, I will never forget. He said, hate killed my son. And therefore I will dedicate the rest of my life to fighting hate. And I thought that was absolutely beautiful. So I thank you for all you've done, and it's just wonderful to see you again. You're a great, great, great man with the most wonderful family and children who continue the work. But let me lead into your question, segue as it were, with a fascinating biblical episode. A bit more volume. You really want to hear this stuff? By all means. I never quite get over that occasion when I was speaking to a rather large room. And somebody at the back said, could you speak a bit louder? I can't hear anything you're saying. And somebody at the front said, I can. Would you like to change places with me? They heard that. The first human children, Cain and Abel, the first recorded act of religious worship in the Bible. They both bring offerings. Abel's, whose intention is benign, is accepted. Cain, whose intentions were not, is rejected. And that first act of recorded religious worship leads to the first murder, the first fratricide. So the Bible is telling us from the very beginning there can be a connection between religion and violence if we are not careful. But there is something absolutely fascinating in the Hebrew Bible at that point that I want to explain to you. There is a verse in Hebrew in Genesis 4 which I have never seen translated correctly. The reason being, it can't be translated. And I'm going to say it to you in Hebrew and then translate it. Vayomer Cain el hevel achiv. And Cain said to Abel his brother, Vayhi biotam basadeh, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose against his brother and killed him. Now, you cannot translate that into English because the syntax is fragmented. It says, and Cain said to his brother Abel, but it doesn't say what he said. The sentence is broken. The syntax is fractured. And the Bible is telling us something very simple. When conversation ends, when words fail, violence begins. And that is why conversation across faiths, like conversation between brothers, is so absolutely essential. Words allow us to recognize the humanity of the other. And conversation between one another is as holy as the conversation between us and God that we call prayer. So that's how it begins. It begins in something called sibling rivalry. And when brothers become estranged, they can, even in the name of worshiping God, come to kill one another.
Thank you, Lord Sachs. I would also like to start by welcoming you and Lady Sachs to American University. As you know, you have been a great spiritual mentor to me and always inspired me by your wisdom and your generosity. And in fact, I don't deserve it at all. Even in this book, you've been so kind, very typically of you. For me, I want to step back a little bit. And this may be interesting to you in the audience. I come from South Asia. I'm a Muslim. I carry the Abrahamic tradition. So to me, Abraham is a central seminal figure in faith. 5 times a day in my prayers, I acknowledge Abraham and his descendants. Who are his descendants? The sons of Isaac and Ismail. Now, to force me to choose one or the other son or their descendants and to deny the humanity of the other makes no sense. It is illogical and it is immoral. So when I see a situation where people are stabbing each other and killing each other every few hours, I really feel that this is the greatest challenge we face as common humanity. When my friend Professor Brenner says that just a Jew and a Muslim sitting and talking, the visual challenges the hatred around us. We've reached the point when just a simple discussion between two friends is enough to give hope. And that is also symptomatic of how low we have sunk. And we were just talking about Andalusia and a time in history when Jews, Muslims, and Christians, for long periods, there's no ideal society in history, but for long periods could live together, create together, and prosper together. Where the great Maimonides, the greatest rabbi of the Middle Ages, was able to work within a tradition and be inspired by a tradition that was an Islamic tradition. We were just discussing that. So for us at this stage, the lowest point, as it were, and I'm seeing so much commentary which almost gives up, which challenges our faith, because the Abrahamic tradition does not allow us to give up and stop thinking of the word hope, when we have to fall back on our resources. And I think this is the ultimate test, the spiritual test for our faiths. I had a question for Lord Sachs, Professor Brenner, with your permission. I saw in Lord Sachs, in your work, The Dignity of Difference, the first major book which you were kind enough to send to me, and I got at American University is a great gift with your beautiful inscription in it, a reaching out. And I thought to myself, here's a chief rabbi, Orthodox, and he's reaching out. And then his other book, Tikkun Olam, To Heal a Fractured World. So the series of books, and now this latest one, and I saw a trajectory of a deeply spiritual thinker taking him wherever his thought and his spirituality took him. And my question was, where do you think this trajectory is going to lead you to?
Let's step back, if I can, and just tell you the moment at which I decided to write Dignity of Difference. If you remember, after 9/11, the World Economic Forum that's normally held in Davos was held that year, the next January in New York, just to express our solidarity with the people of New York. And a group of us, a group of religious leaders, leading imams from the Middle East, Chief Rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, gurus and leaders of all faiths, stood together at Ground Zero and uttered prayers. And all of a sudden, I was just struck by this revelation of the power of religion to harm or to heal, to divide or to unite. And I suddenly realized that this was not a one-off. I had a very strong intuition that it was the beginning of something, not the end of something. And I realized we had to take sides. At that point, we had to take sides. Do we see religion as a force for bringing us together or splitting us apart? And at that point, I resolved to write a book that would be the most powerful statement I could possibly utter as a Jew, and to be published on the first anniversary of 9/11, which it was. It was a bit strong, actually. It was one of those 50% proof whiskeys, you know, where you take it, a bit too much of it too suddenly, and you suffer the consequences. And I have to say, some people thought I'd gone too far. From which I learned, incidentally, that you have to pace yourself, because if you're going to overcome suspicions and hostilities that have grown up over centuries, you can't suddenly wish them away overnight. So that's why I've taken time. But I did think that that was going to be, I suddenly knew that 9/11 was where the 21st century began, and this was going to be our biggest single challenge. And I don't think anything that's happened between then and now has caused me to change my mind. And that is why I felt I had to come up with some grounded account based on religious sources. I was not going to use a 21st century postmodernism, because that might be fine in a university, but does that work on the streets of Karachi or Beirut or Aleppo? It's got to be so grounded in our basic texts. And so I had a look at those basic texts. And I came up with this idea that somehow or other the Bible is telling us, with the story of Cain and Abel, that one of the drivers of violence is what I call sibling rivalry. And here I want to refer to a very great scholar, Frenchman, who taught here in America, who died just a few days ago, the late René Girard. René Girard was perhaps the greatest writer on the connection between religion and violence. His most famous work is called Violence and the Sacred, 1972 in French, 77 in English. And he, a devotee of Freud, but nonetheless saw more clearly than Freud that the primary driver of violence is not the Oedipal complex between sons and fathers, but what he called mimetic desire, the desire to have what somebody else has, of which the most common form is sibling rivalry. So I want you to think about this. Girard is clearly justified in terms of ancient myth. Set and Osiris is a story of sibling rivalry, the founding myth of Rome, two brothers, Romulus and Remus. Hamlet begins with Hamlet's uncle, Claudius, killing his brother and usurping his throne. But the classic place, you want real sibling rivalry, we do family arguments better than anyone else in the world. This is a Jewish speciality. And so you've got to look in the book of Genesis, and you see there 4 stories of sibling rivalry: Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. Now, you read those stories, you think we are fated always to argue. But I suggested, don't look at those stories. Ignore everything about those stories except the last scene in each case, right? What is the last scene in Cain and Abel? Abel lies dead. What is the last scene in Isaac and Ishmael? They are standing together at Abraham's grave. What is the last scene in Jacob and Esau? After a lot of frisson of tension, they meet, they embrace, and they go their separate ways. What is the last scene with Joseph and his brothers? Forgiveness and reconciliation. So there is an upward trajectory here, telling us that sibling rivalry is not inevitable and interminable. And that lays the ground for the beginning of the book of Exodus, in which we see 3 siblings, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, leading together. And I suddenly realized the Bible is telling us violence may begin in sibling rivalry, but the Bible itself is urging us beyond sibling rivalry to that position of mutual respect. And I suddenly thought in this new book, isn't that Jews, Christians, and Muslims? We see ourselves as sibling rivals. We see ourselves each as the most favored child of Abraham. And that is why we are threatened by the others, because we know the others claim to be the most favored child of Abraham. But what good parent loves only one child? And for heaven's sake, do we think that God's love is in such scarce supply that to love me, he has to hate you, that to choose me, he has to reject you? Surely that's not what God is about at all, not the God of whom we say in Psalm 145, his tender mercies are on all his works. Surely not the God of whom we say in the very first chapter of the Bible, set his image and likeness on every single one of us, regardless of color, culture, creed, or class. So if that is the case, the Bible is acknowledging sibling rivalry as a cause of violence, but it is leading us upward beyond it. And it was that upward climb that I found myself traveling from dignity of difference through to heal a fractured world to not in God's name.
If I may follow up, you make a very strong point in your book that we have to reclaim religion from fundamentalism. And if we look at the world today, that seems to be quite challenging task. That seems to be a task for not just Islam and Judaism and Christianity, all religions. And I would like to ask you both, what can we do in concrete terms? And you have some ideas at the end of the book, and I know I saw a wonderful documentary last night Professor Ahmed produced with his team about Islam in Europe. What would you suggest, what could be some of the bridges to build to reclaim religion from fundamentalism, to see that both of the brothers are part of the family and not just one brother, and the sisters as well?
The sisters, absolutely. Leah and Rachel, two sisters who really are our mothers. You know, I mean, this is the essence of it. What I would say is this. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have these rich interpretive traditions. In Judaism, we speak about Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod. The Christian church in the Middle Ages had exactly the same literal, allegorical, moral, and spiritual. And there were the four great schools of Islamic jurisprudence. And we all have these elaborate traditions. And fundamentalism is the attempt to move from text to application without interpretation. And you read any text literally, you're going to do violence to that text. Now, in Judaism, we went a very, very long way to say never read a text literally. And so one of the core beliefs of rabbinic Judaism is, along with the written Torah, comes an oral tradition that interprets that written Torah. And there is a wonderful point in the Talmud. There are many points where this comes up, where somebody, Elijah, the prophet, who kind of commutes between heaven and earth, you know. So if any of the rabbis want to know what God is saying up there, they speak to Elijah, who occasionally sits in on the divine seminar where they're studying Bible. And the rabbis are arguing, what is the meaning of this verse in the Bible? So they ask Elijah, what does God say is the meaning of this verse that he wrote? And Elijah replies, God sits there giving this Bible class, saying, my son, Rabbi X, says this verse means this, and my son, Rabbi Y, says the verse means that. So somebody says to God, God, you wrote this verse. So which does it mean? Who's right, Rabbi X or Rabbi Y? And God replies, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. They're both right. Well, God was going to say that anyway. This is God's method of conflict resolution. So we understand here that the rabbis had this doctrine of 70 faces to the Torah. One of our rabbis even said 600,000 faces to the Torah. Each of us has a unique interpretation. And the meaning of the verse is the totality of those interpretations. And this, of course, is saying something incredibly beautiful. In fact, I noticed somebody with a name tag here, Levinas. Is that right? Are you related to the philosopher Levinas? Well, let me say in the name of your namesake, Emmanuel Levinas has a wonderful essay on Revelation in the Jewish tradition. And he explains that the Hebrew Bible leaves so much unsaid that we actually only know what it means when we have the human interpretation. So the divine word is itself a meeting between God who speaks and humans who interpret what he says. So that principle, that to move from text to application without studying the interpretation, is simply unacceptable. And what I tried to say in the book, I think, and I'm sure Akbar, you would say this as well, is that Christianity and Islam have exactly the same attitude. Never just read a text or never just use a text to justify violence.
Well, this is the problem for us, people looking at religion and making sense of faith and violence, or trying to make sense of it and trying to explain it. To me, I find that it helps, and that's why I was so impressed by your work as a chief rabbi. You were constantly using knowledge, analysis, and rational thought to make sense of what seemed to be religion. I think theologians would benefit immensely by understanding anthropology. Anthropology is a subject which looks at all of society, theology, history, culture. It looks at Islam and it understands that Islam is essentially a religion of balance, deen and dunya, that is this world and the next, the internal world and the external world. An Islamic society must have justice, compassion, it must have a sense of equity, not these vast gaps between the very rich and the very poor. Now, Lord Sachs, ask yourself, where today in the Muslim world will you get this? That balance has been affected. So as an anthropologist, again with my wonderful team, American University team, and many of them are here today, I looked at 4 projects over the last decade, since 9/11. The project I want to refer to, which will complement your work, is The Thistle and the Drone, the book I just gave you. In The Thistle and the Drone, I looked at 40 case studies. 40 case studies from Morocco right up to Chechnya, of tribal societies which were Muslim, in various stages of being Muslim, but Muslim, tribal. Now suddenly you introduce a new word, tribal. What does that mean? It means that female genital mutilation, honor killings, so many things that you associate with Islam are in fact just tribal. The code of revenge. There's a saying among the Pashtuns, I took revenge after 100 years and I took it too soon. Straight tribalism. It's nothing to do with Islam, where there is no revenge in Islam. And when you put these together, Lord Sachs, 40 case studies, you suddenly realize you're looking at a dynamic that is being missed in the analysis. So people looking at these societies will say, well, Islam is behind this because these are Muslims. Which verse of the Quran explains this behavior? But in fact, there is no verse explaining it. You mentioned my friend Judea Pearl and his son. What verse of the Quran explains a young reporter sitting in Karachi who is there to promote understanding of the Muslim world, whose throat is slit? Where does it say that in the Quran? And yet people will say, well, somehow it has to be. So like Cinderella's sisters, they're forcing the foot into the slipper simply because they must do it as an exercise. And I believe that this relationship between the tribal societies, between the central government, which are failing them throughout the Muslim world. Again, if you look at societies from Morocco right up to Central Asia, central governments are not providing this balance that I spoke of. That failure in turn creates a vacuum, and that vacuum is creating movements like IS, Islamic, this terrible eruption in the Middle East, the Taliban, the TTP. Lord Sachs, which Islamic verse allows you or provokes you or prompts you to come into a school, which the TTP did in Peshawar, and shoot 150 students, Muslim students. So there's absolutely no logic or rationality there. It is a breakdown, and it's a breakdown of a certain kind of society, which in turn creates a vacuum, which in turn allows movements like this to express themselves. Now, because they're all Muslim, technically, we say they're Muslim and therefore Islam. So I think it's important that for theologians to have some sense of society, of culture, of anthropology, so we're able to really begin to understand what's going on, because unless you understand what's going on, it's going to be very difficult to solve it. If you go to a surgeon and say, my leg is paining, and he starts opening up your mind or your brain, obviously he's not going to get to the root of the problem. That is why I think it's critical for religious scholars to begin to understand society and its dynamics.
And let me just complement that by saying this. You're absolutely right. What is happening here is not a product of scholarship, of Islamic scholarship. It's a product of total absence of that scholarship and of exploiting a selective series of quotations, taking texts out of context and out of their classic interpretation. And this then becomes something dangerously akin to idolatry. God makes us in his image. That is faith. When we make God in our image, that is idolatry. When we exploit religion to serve our purposes, when we use religion as the cloak of sanctity to disguise the naked pursuit of power, that is when real violence is done to religion itself. And when you start doing violence to religion, you end by doing violence to people. And that is why I think one aim of scholarship to say, this is not what the text is saying, this is not what Islam or Judaism or Christianity actually is. I think there is another thing here, not just anthropology, and that's absolutely vital, but also history.
Yeah, history, part of it, yes.
Because I think I want to be able to say, where did this happen in the past? Where did we have moments like this internecine violence? I mean, we just read today there was a terrible terrorist attack on Shia Muslims in Beirut, I think, on
Yes.
Hezbollah by ISIS. And to my mind, as a Jew, this takes me back to the last days of the Second Temple, when we had Jewish zealots, we had Jewish terrorists. They actually were called the dagger carriers, the Sicarii. And they were busy killing their enemies, but they were busy killing their friends as well. They were killing their fellow Jews who were not as zealous as they were. The Talmud calls this sinat chinam, gratuitous internal hatred. But if you read Josephus, who was an eyewitness to these events, he actually graphically describes what was happening in Jerusalem, which is not a million miles from what is happening in parts of Syria and Iraq today. Now, what was the result of that? The result of that was the destruction of the Second Temple, the Roman conquest, and eventually, after the Part 2 and Part 3, the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132, a self-inflicted tragedy which resulted in almost 2,000 years of exile. It took Jews and Judaism almost 2,000 years to recover from that self-inflicted tragedy. It took Europe. Christians were murdering each other across Europe in the second half of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th century, the 30 Years' War. 1 in 3 of the population of Central Europe died as a result of the 30 Years' War. What was the result of that? Religion became a kind of associated with conflict and with violence, and thus began the long process of secularization. Secularization did not begin in Europe when people stopped believing in God. Newton and Descartes, the heroes of the 17th century believed in God very much indeed. Secularization happened when people stopped believing in the ability of people of God to live peaceably together. So as Jews and as Christians, we can say to the Muslim radicals of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab and Al-Nusra and others, please don't go down this road, because this ends not in the destruction of the enemies of Islam, it ends in the destruction of your own faith.
And that's where information, knowledge, understanding becomes so vital, because these people, Lord Sachs, and I've studied them for this particular project, they're really illiterate. They have very limited understanding of Islam. You know, you were talking of the great scholars in Andalusia when Jews and Muslims and Christians were able to work together and live together. These aren't scholars and philosophers, the kinds you're referring to. These have a very limited understanding, but they have the power of emotion, so they can motivate followers who are prepared to walk in and blow themselves up. And that's something that baffles me, creates great despair in me, and it's something that must be fought and checked. Because as you say rightly, it's so self-destructive.
Yeah. And I think I just want to add, because you have spoken about this already this evening, but I just wanted to I wanted to echo it. This wonderful story that we must all revisit, which is the experience of Andalusia under benign Islamic rule from the 10th to 12th centuries. Because that is the precedent that should be guiding us right now. The idea that Jews, Christians, and Muslims should live together in mutual respect is not utopian. We have been there before. And we were there in Andalusia under benign Islamic rule, and the end result was this, that it was Islamic scholars who brought back Europe out of the Dark Age. They recovered the great wisdom of ancient Greece. It was the Islamic scholars who brought back Neoplatonism and Neo-Aristotelianism and developed not these schools of exegesis and philosophy, and it was absolutely brilliant, and algebra and all the rest of it. They then had this huge influence on the rabbi called Moses Maimonides, the greatest rabbi of the Middle Ages. Now, anyone who has read Moses Maimonides, The Guide for the Perplexed, knows that throughout this, the single greatest work of Jewish philosophy ever written, he is in constant dialogue with the Islamic philosophers, the Mutakallimun, as he calls them. But people don't know that it was also the Islamic beauty and architectonics of the codes of Sharia law that inspired Maimonides to write the greatest code of Jewish law ever written, the Mishneh Torah. It was the Islamic ability to codify Islamic faith that led Maimonides to formulate his great principle of the 13 principles of Jewish faith. And that was just Maimonides. As for his son, Rabbi Avram ben Arambam, Rabbi Abraham, son of Maimonides, he loved Sufism. He was much more mystical than his dad. Well, you know, that's, your kids, you know, they go beyond you in certain ways. So even Sufism had this influence on Maimonides' son. Now, Maimonides' work had a huge impact on Christianity, and it then led, a century later, to the greatest Christian thinker of the Middle Ages, Aquinas. So you have here, first a Muslim enlightenment leading to a Jewish enlightenment, leading to a Christian enlightenment. And these were some of the intellectual as well as spiritual high points of the Middle Ages. And the fact is, if we were there once, we can be there again.
Thank you. I think at this point, I would like to bring in a Christian voice as well, since we have heard from a Muslim thinker and a Jewish thinker. We're very happy to have Reverend Joseph Eldridge here, who will bring a little different perspective from here. And I would also like to say that we are collecting the questions for a Q&A period on index cards. So, Patrick, is someone going around with cards?
Yes, we have two ushers here.
We have two ushers. So if you have questions, please write them down, and we will read them to the two panelists here as much time as we have. Reverend.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here and share this opportunity to be with. I don't spend a lot of time with Lord Rabbis, frankly. So and if you believe in providence, you have to believe that something celestial was working when Akbar Ahmed came to American University simultaneously with 9/11.
Yeah.
And his voice, his prophetic voice, has resonated from this university. I have the privilege of, I think Jason Binkendorf is here, right? Right here, of occupying this building, being an inhabitant of this building right next door, the K Spiritual Life Center. So I am a United Methodist. My father was a United Methodist preacher, and I have had the privilege of being at this university for a while. But I think I want to just say a word about our interfaith culture, our interfaith context at American University, since this is an interfaith dialogue. And two brothers, 50 years ago, two brothers, a devout Methodist layman, Hearst Anderson, the president of American University, and Abraham Kay, a very prominent Jewish businessman, came together and in some ways were trailblazers. They were prescient. They envisioned creating, now remember, 50 years ago, interfaith has become fashionable. 50 years ago, I can assure you, interfaith was not fashionable. And I watched my Ivy League university chaplain colleagues scramble to retrofit Christian churches and make them into interfaith spaces. It's a challenge. But they're making progress. Well, we are blessed to have the space that was designed to be interfaith. The Rabbi Sachs comments that science takes things apart to help us understand how they work. Religion puts things together so that we can figure out what it means. And in the K Spiritual Life Center, somebody said the business of the K Spiritual Life Center is meaning. What is meaning? And interfaith is built into the DNA of American University. Students pass in front of the chapel and they see 25 faith communities. They don't think a thing about it. When we have visitors from abroad, from Middle East, from Africa and other parts of the world, and they recognize that all of the faith communities occupy the very same space, they are absolutely flabbergasted. Now, one of the ways in which this was made very, very powerful to me was on 9/11 itself. On 9/11 itself, the university was traumatized. We were all traumatized. The terrorist attacks took place in the morning. Flyers were distributed throughout the university to announce that people would be gathering. And where did people want? People wanted to gather together, to be together. And where did they come? They came to the steps of the Interfaith Center. People were pouring out of their offices, staff and faculty. Students left their television sets to come and gather on the steps of the K Center, where we had the voices from the sacred texts of the Abrahamic faiths and other faiths in a way that was a powerful expression of symbol. So it's a real honor to be here. May I, if I will, I have the floor. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And the questions are coming. I have a question. If I may raise a question, if I have a question. One of my favorite sentences in the book: to insist that being loved entails that others be unloved is to fail to understand love itself. So what are some of the ways that we can learn, now this is the question, to love evil, to learn to love the unlovable, to learn to love those who hate?
That's a tough one. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Eldridge. Do you want to relate to that one?
Yeah, I do actually. One of the, I mean, this is technically a very difficult subject, but it's a very important anthropological one. That we have more than one kind of moral system. I was speaking this morning or this afternoon at the Brookings Institute. I mentioned something very fascinating that took place here in America after Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, Americans realized that they were going to have to wage a war against a nation they didn't understand. And they asked one of America's great anthropologists, Ruth Benedict, to explain the Japanese to us, which she did, and it was a very important act because although it didn't necessarily allow America to win the war, it helped America win the peace. And the work that she did was published after the war as a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And in it, she makes a difference between what is known as a shame culture and a guilt culture. And Japan, like ancient Greece, is a shame culture, whereas Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are guilt cultures. Now, what is the difference between a shame culture and a guilt culture? In a shame culture, evil is like an indelible stain on the person. So if you remember in Victorian, I don't suppose you watch Victorian English plays, you know, where one of the characters is shamed. He either has to go off to Australia, or you hear him go up to the library and you hear a gunshot, and, you know, he kills himself because there's no way of separating shame from the person. It's indelible. And that's why shame cultures don't have an obvious concept of forgiveness, for instance. Whereas in guilt cultures, there's a difference between the person and the deed. The deed may be thoroughly evil, but the person remains a person in the image of God. And that is why when you're able to atone for the deed, your worth as a person remains. Hence, this principle, axiomatic to the Abrahamic monotheisms, love the sinner, hate the sin. And that is how we can love people who do very unlovable things, because we separate between what they do and what they essentially are. And that really is the basis of forgiveness, which is at the heart of Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
Do we have the cards? Well, before I get the cards, I just want to share what you said before, that there aren't too many Lord Rabbis. I'm always reminded of a good friend of mine who was ordained by your predecessor, Lord Yakubovitz, and when he was asked by whom he was ordained, he said, I was ordained by the Lord himself. So I'm sure a lot of your disciples say that as well.
Once you're mentioning this, I will tell you this experience that I had in New York just a couple of months ago. I was speaking at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue in New York. It was my second visit to the synagogue, and the rabbi got up and introduced me by saying, when I mentioned to our Interfaith group that Rabbi Sachs was coming to visit us for the second time, there was an enormous interest, especially among the Christian clergy. And he said, I wasn't sure why. All I said was, this Saturday we are going to celebrate the second coming of the Lord.
Wonderful. Well, we'll hope we have you here for a second time soon. I have a lot of cards. We don't have that much time. I also got a few questions from Rabbi Lustig before. I'm starting with one of them. What practical steps should organized religious congregations and academic institutions take to counter the religious hate we see on the internet or played out in the world in violent acts? You say if religion can be used to teach hate, it can be used to teach love. How do we achieve this in a systematic way?
Akbar, do you want to begin?
Lord Sykes, is a great question. It's a practical question. It's something we've been discussing, but here's a live question dealing with live societies. I want to give a concrete example again as an anthropologist. 9/11 happened, and I just arrived in Washington, literally a week before. One of my first classes, and 9/11 happened. The plane flew into the Pentagon while I was speaking. And while this was happening, I understood that my life would never be the same, that I would have to be involved, I would have to give everything I had in return for the wonderful and warm reception I got in the United States. Rabbi Bruce Lustig, who I had not met, by a sheer, I would say almost divine providence, met me through his wonderful wife, Amy. We were at dinner, she was sitting with me. I just arrived, so we were chatting, and she said, I'm Bruce Lustig's wife, so I looked blank, and she said, you never heard of my husband? I said, I'm sorry, I haven't. He said, he's the senior rabbi of Washington. And of course, we very quickly became friends, and Bruce took the initiative, Lord Sykes, and changed the map here in Washington. His work will be one day recognized in history because with Bishop John Chain, the Bishop of Washington, we formed, under his leadership, the first Abraham Summit. The very idea of a rabbi sitting on the stage with a Muslim scholar and a bishop, which he organized in the sanctuary, made such a huge impact. Initially, Muslims were quite reluctant. You remember, Bruce, in the first few rounds? And today you have the biggest Islamic center, the Dulles Mosque Center there, very happily working with him. You have the Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, all of them. So at that moment in time, in a practical sense, you need religious leaders, not just to be religious leaders looking at the text, but actual moral leaders showing through compassion why it's important to interpret the text. And my wife, who's not here unfortunately this evening, she would constantly cite Bruce Lustig, and she would say that when he speaks about the oppressed, and he's saying Muslims as a minority today are the oppressed, he's talking as a rabbi. So he's not compromising his role as rabbi. He's saying, as a rabbi, I must speak like this because this is what I'm commanded to do. And in turn, I found that the Muslims began to respond. Muslims are finding that someone has some sympathy, they're understanding, and they responded so that I remember one of our first spiritual unity walks, the flanks were guarded by Muslims. These young Muslim boys had brought water and sandwiches. It was a very moving moment. Remember this straight after 9/11 when there was shock, there was distrust. The Muslim community was had been traumatized because they had no idea, number one, their beloved country has been attacked, and number two, it's been attacked by other Muslims. So these are the moments that test us. These are the moments that really test our mettle, and these are the moments that I think, in response to the question, we must rise, each one of us, whatever our background, however religious we are or not, and respond to the crisis, because ultimately, each one of us is linked, not only through the Abrahamic faith, but on this planet, which is in such a dire condition, that we have to work and live together, understanding if the boat sinks, everyone sinks, not just Jews or Muslims or Christians.
Thank you. Well, that's a tremendous tribute. Could I say, Bruce, please stand up and let us salute you. Stand up.